Hi, let me discuss a couple of videos related to the cost of the economic crisis. First one is going to be about the interactions that we have in the economy. The second one will be about the supply chain and maybe address some of the issues about how to provide incentives and help to the workers. So and the first one is mostly about the interactions, and therefore it's thinking about what should be the coordinated fiscal and monetary policy to try to ameliorate the cost of the crisis. Let me start by stating what are the actors that we would like to pay attention. We want to pay attention to households, which are at the center of the crisis. We're asking them and requesting them to stay home. We have the retailers and all the distribution. We have the firms that are producing the goods and services, and we have the banks. These four actors interact with each other, and in fact, they rely on each other for their solvency. And therefore, if we ask one of them to stop, if we ask one of them to, for example, stop consuming, in the end, we have the whole system being affected. Let's see. Firms produce goods and services that sent to retailers, and those goods and services imply that there are payments that will happen from retailers back to firms. Okay. By the way, most of those payments are happening through credit. By the way, the retailers then provide the goods to the consumers, and the consumers actually are they consume in the retailers. By the way, the consumers offer their labor services, so these are the jobs and the work. So there's a relationship between the households and the firms, and vice versa. The firms produce and give salaries to the households. At the same time, financial institutions, they provide mortgages to the households, mostly those. They're also trade credit and consumer credit. Consumers are actually saving in the banks. A very important aspect that banks also do is they provide lending to the firms. And firms actually have to make payments back to the banks in the form of interest payments. There are more relationships, like for example, banks also lend to retailers, and the supply chains are a bit longer, so I will discuss that in a different one. But for the moment, this is more or less how we are interconnected with each other. And the problem is that we want to produce a slowdown in the economy. This is very important to realize that the recession is a public healthcare measure. So we want a recession. We want a slowdown because the slowdown will imply less contact. And as we discussed before, we need less contact to reduce the amount of contagion. So therefore, we don't want people at work. We don't want people at the retail industry. We just don't want people to be interacting with each other. We want to keep all of them at home, and we want to slow down everything. What that means is that many of these channels are going to be threatened. And I think that that's an important aspect of what the central bank can do. Let me highlight, let me choose yellow to highlight the impact of what we're requesting. So the first thing we're asking consumers is to stay home and have less contacts. Okay, so that will imply that we're going to consume less, and because the consumption is going to be smaller, retailers' profits are going to go down, which means that retail payments to firms are going to go down. That means that firms' profits are going to be somehow deteriorated or hurt. So profits will go down, and that's something that will happen automatically. Very importantly, because the profits are going to go down, it's very likely that workers' salaries will go down and income. So jobs will be lost, and actually income that the consumers are going to receive is likely to go down. That will imply that, for example, mortgages will not be able to be paid, rent likely will not be able to be paid. And in fact, you can think of rent as something that goes from households to households, okay? This will be the rent, and the rent will also be affected. Very likely savings will be drawn. And in the end, because the whole economy is in slowdown, very likely firms might go into bankruptcy. So as you can see, almost everything is affected. By the way, I'm going to talk about the supply chain in a second, and the supply chain is to talk about the provision of goods and services. But you can imagine that if the firms are going bankrupt, then the goods and services will not be supplied, and therefore retailers at the end will have nothing to sell. So the whole system is being affected. Now, this is where the central bank enters, and where the central bank can make a big difference, a big impact on what the economy is going to do, because the Fed can provide help, resources to all of this. But it's not only the Fed. We also need the Treasury, or the fiscal side, fiscal policy. Because fiscal policy has to support many of the activities that are going to happen. So the Fed, for example, let me just draw this in a different color, like the Fed color. The Fed can help by providing, for example, a very cheap lending to banks, and therefore the Fed will help the banking system, and that will allow the banks to get cheap loans, and therefore we can request, for example, a moratorium on mortgages. Now, in order for us to request a moratorium on mortgages, we need to provide the help of the banks so they can actually do that. Furthermore, we can request ask firms to not fire anybody, so therefore salaries will tend to be relatively constant. In order to do that, we need to, again, provide support either directly to the firms or to the banks, so the banks provide more lending to the firms. In other words, what we're doing is supporting or complementing what the economy is not doing. We are doing that through the Fed. By the way, the Fed can help both firms and retailers directly to provide enough liquidity, so actually payments will occur even though there's no consumption. We want to provide all this help, but it's very important that we do not incentivize consumption. This has to remain low. So the actions that the government is thinking about giving $1,000 to every family or to every member of a family in the United States, it's very important that people don't use that to go to the supermarket or to go to the Apple store. They should go to the Apple store later, but not today. Right now, they need to actually stay home. Everything that I said also needs to be supported by the fiscal authority. So the fiscal authority also can have the ability to affect banks. They have a very important impact on profits and taxes. So this comes through taxation, both on firms and retailers, and also on the payments or the jobs. We can have job preservation policies, like, for example, what Germany did, which are the payroll taxes. That was a very good policy that was implemented in Germany. We can also tell firms that the tax cut is contingent to keeping the jobs. At the end of the day, the purpose is to keep jobs alive, that even if salary or income to the household goes down, that is okay. We can make it go down transitorily, but we need to provide to the households relief. And the relief can come through rent payments and moratoriums on rent, moratoriums on mortgages. So they don't have payments, but they still need to consume certain amount of goods or services. The whole point is we don't want to create incentives for consumers to get out of the house. We want to create incentives for them to stay home. And that's more or less how we are going to keep the system and the economic costs to be minimal. The main message that I want to give today is twofold. First, it is absolutely crucial that we provide help to the system. The Federal Reserve and the fiscal authorities have the ability and the tools to do so. The Fed is going to help through providing very cheap credit, and is going to provide credit to the banking system, directly to the firms, directly to the retailers, and here the important thing are the small firms. Small firms are very unlikely to be able to trade with the Fed, and therefore the banking system plays a crucial role and providing the lending and the liquidity to those firms. We need to put the economy in standstill, and therefore we need to ask everybody to slow down, give moratoriums on almost all of our financial transactions. And that implies that somebody has to take the tab. And I think the Fed is willing to do so, and in fact some of the policies that they have implemented are directed to provide liquidity and safety to the whole financial system. The fiscal authority has has tools that can be more targeted, and the message there is that they can actually attend particular industries differently than others. Those that are more sensitive, individuals that are more likely to lose their jobs. Very important is to understand that in the end we want a slowdown on consumption. It is very, very important, and I don't think that actually people at Congress understand this. They think that they just have to substitute the same amount of income to the households that they were receiving before. That's not actually what we should do. We should provide income and resources for them to be able to make the payments and to be able to have the minimum consumption that is required, and we're asking and requesting them to do. We don't need to provide income so people can travel for tourism. We don't want them to travel. We don't want them to go to a concert. We don't want them to actually go to the mall. We want everybody to stay home and reduce the amount of contacts, and for that matter, the amount of income that is required is much smaller than our regular salaries. So we need to understand that some support has to be provided. But we don't want to provide support that is so big that people have incentives to go out. These are the two messages. Support is required, and in the end we want to understand that support is to keep the system from hitting insolvency. What we want in the end is also to have a slowdown. In the next video I will address issues related to the supply chain.